Hello historians and welcome back to part 2 on the life of King Henry VII, the first monarch of one of England's infamous royal families, the Tudors. In the last episode, we explored Henry Tudor's early life, the time before he was king, the battle that won him the kingship, and the first year of his reign that saw the marriage to his beloved wife, Elizabeth of York, and the birth of their first child, Prince Arthur. Between 1486 and 1503, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth had 7 children. However, 3 of those children, Elizabeth, Edmund and Catherine, all died in infancy. The other 4 children all made it to adulthood-ish. The next surviving child after Arthur was Margaret, the future Queen of Scotland and arguably the saviour of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Tudor was born on the 28th of November 1489. Despite being shunned by her younger brother Henry, Margaret would arguably be the most important figure in history out of all of Henry and Elizabeth's children, as it would be Margaret and her descendants that shaped the English and British monarchy into what we know today. On the 24th of May, 1487, King Henry VII received his first major threat against the throne when Lambert Simnel was crowned King of England by his supporters in Dublin. But the 2 warring houses were reunited by Henry and Elizabeth's marriage. They have an heir that is both of York and Lancaster. So why would people want to revolt? Well, I'm glad you asked, you lovely listener. When Henry became king, many Yorkists had been disposed of at court. Understandably, Henry wanted people he could trust and reduce his ever-growing paranoia and anxiety. However, those Yorkists that had been disposed of at court saw a reverse in their finances, which as a result led to many plots to depose the new king. Plus, I'm sure the benefactor of Lambert Simnel had some personal motives too. Simnel was provided with a formidable military force that included 2,000 mercenaries, all of which was paid for by Margaret of Burgundy, the sister to George, Duke of Clarence, and Kings Edward IV and Richard III. Simnel was claiming that he was Edward, the Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Kings Edward IV and Richard III. The real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was the son of their brother George, Duke of Clarence, and to the unhappy Yorkists, the rightful heir to the throne. Henry and Simnel's forces met on the 16th of June. This was known as the Battle of Stoke. Simnel's forces were defeated at the Battle of Stoke, and this was the last major threat to Henry's throne. Because of this, some historians view the Battle of Stoke as the last remnants of the Cousins' War, also known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry realised Simnel was a fake and employed him in the royal kitchens. You might be thinking, "Oh, that's nice of him. Give him a job, put him in the kitchens. Makes a real change from chopping his head off." Well, you see, the thing is, growing up with relatively no money, compared to what he had as king anyway, meant that Henry was rather stingy when it came to spending money, and it was more expensive to send Simnel to jail than what it would be to pay him for honest work. Henry may have also genuinely felt sorry for a young man who was clearly trying to earn some money. Simnel was also better to Henry alive than what he was dead, as it isn't a great PR move to execute the man that some people believed was the rightful king, and if he was dead, Simnel would not be able to tell the people his real name and that it was all a scam. However, Simnel's actions did not come without repercussions. This uprising reminded King Henry of the powerful position that the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, and his sister Margaret Pole held in England, and the potential threat that they caused to him and his dynasty. Also, side note, because Simnel had been crowned King Edward VI, King Henry VII's future grandson, also known as King Edward VI, is technically either King Edward VII or King Edward VI II. Between 1488 and 1489, Henry focused on improving his position on the European power stage by arranging an alliance, or a wedding, between his son Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Castile and Aragon. Ferdinand and Isabella represented everything that seemed desirable to King Henry VII. Having his son and heir marry an infanta of Spain was a massive power play and meant more to England than what it would to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were descendants of ancient monarchies. Their position was strong and their reputation was glorious. In March 1488, Ferdinand sent a representative to check the 19-month-old Arthur for deformities. Arthur was said to be dressed in gold. Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed by their reports of their future son-in-law. However, they were concerned about sending their daughter to a country whose king might be disposed of at any time. The events of Lambert Simnel the previous year was very fresh in their mind. Eventually, the union was agreed, Ferdinand agreeing to trade his daughter for English support in a war against France. In March 1489, they signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo. The treaty stated that the Infanta Catherine would bring 200,000 crowns as her dowry. That's roughly about 5 million today. And it confirmed the engagement between the English prince and the Infanta. Later that year, Henry would sign the Treaty of Redon, where he agreed to send 6,000 troops to Brittany to prevent neighbouring France from invading England, and his daughter Margaret was born in the November. 1491 saw the birth of King Henry VII's third surviving child, Henry, Duke of York, the future King Henry VIII. And also, on the 28th of June, golf was banned in Scotland. This was because King James saw it as a wasteful pastime. Nothing to do with Tudors, but I thought I would just add it in there. Jump ahead 5 years to 1496, and Henry and Elizabeth's last surviving child, Mary, future Queen of France, was born on the 18th of March. 1497 was a bit of a busy year for Henry VII. He sent his future daughter-in-law Catherine a blessed ring as a token of his fatherly affection. Cute. More likely to keep her father sweet for the dowry, as that was still about a decade away. And the couple were formally betrothed at the ancient palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire during the August. But 1497 saw the return of Margaret of Burgundy. Clearly, this woman had a grudge against the Tudors. Whether she genuinely thought the pretenders were her family, as she had not lived in England for years, is unknown. But this time, she was back with Perkin Warbeck. Perkin Warbeck was claiming to be Prince Richard, Elizabeth of York's brother, and the prince who went missing in the Tower with Edward V. Warbeck had been throwing around his claim that he was Richard from about 1490, trying to gain support the same way that Lambert Simnel had back in 87. Warbeck at one point had the support of King Charles IX of France, King James IV of Scotland, Maximilian I of Austria, and Margaret of Burgundy, just to name a few. The support of these royals fluctuated throughout the years, but during that time, Margaret had coached Warbeck on how to impersonate Richard. Warbeck had tried and failed to invade England 3 times before being captured in 1497. Henry originally pardoned Warbeck and fined the lords who supported him, actually making a £1,500 profit by overcharging. However, after several failed revolutions, Henry had Warbeck beheaded along with the real Edward Earl of Warwick, son of George Duke of Clarence, on the 21st of November 1499 at Tower Hill. After this, Henry had multiple smaller attempts against him, like when his son died and when his wife died, as the family seemed vulnerable. But the challenge to Henry's reign continued throughout his life until he was succeeded by his son, King Henry VIII. The execution of Edward, Earl of Warwick, can seem unnecessary, as he was not linked to this uprising, nor did he really have any part in Simnel's. However, with every revolt by a pretender, Henry grew more and more concerned about the threat that George Duke of Clarence's children posed. Margaret Pole was likely spared due to being a woman, although that would not be enough to save her later in life, and Ferdinand was pushing pressure on Henry. Ferdinand was in no hurry to send his daughter to England. The recent appearance of Perkin Warbeck, and the continued existence of Edward Earl of Warwick had made him cautious, and he was starting to look elsewhere for husbands for his daughter. This was likely the reason why Edward Earl of Warwick joined Warbeck, and he apparently plotted to escape the prison in the Tower of London with Perkin Warbeck. Oddly enough, Henry VII took a liking to Warbeck's wife, the Lady Catherine Gordon. His accounts show that he brought Catherine fancy clothes and expensive gifts, and she became a close companion even after Henry VII had her husband executed. Disaster struck at Christmas that year when a fire took place at Sheen Palace. The fire burned for 3 hours, nearly destroying the whole palace. Tapestries were turned to ash. The Tudor family barely made it out alive, but Henry had the palace rebuilt as the more familiar Richmond Palace. On the 19th of May, 1499, a proxy wedding took place at Prince Arthur's manor house at Bewdley, near Worcester. The wedding was officiated by Sir Richard Pole, and it was at this point that Ferdinand put the pressure on Henry to execute the Earl of Warwick, and when Henry, who was desperate to keep his Spanish friend, charged Edward with treason for conspiring with Warbeck, the simple-minded fool pleaded guilty. Why would you plead guilty for something you didn't do? I will never know because I wasn't there, but I'm really struggling to understand why Edward Earl of Warwick actually pleaded guilty. Maybe he had more to do with it than what we know? A second proxy wedding took place again at Bewdley exactly 2 years later to the day in 1501, and Henry and Arthur first met the Infanta Catherine on the 4th of November at the Bishop's Palace in Dogsmithfield. Henry rather embarrassed himself on this occasion. Catherine, who was exhausted from travelling, was sleeping. Henry was furious that he was not allowed to see the daughter-in-law that he had purchased for his son. Thinking that there was something wrong with her and that the Spanish were hiding something, Henry pretty much argued with them until they caved. They woke Catherine, and Henry was relieved that she was as pretty as described. Then they exchanged pleasantries through an interpreter, to which Arthur reportedly said to his parents, he had never felt so much joy in his life as when he beheld the sweet face of his bride. Now that's kind of super cute. Catherine and Arthur conversed together in Latin, and later that evening, Catherine entertained the king and her groom in her chamber with music and dancing. Henry and Arthur took their leave the next morning. On the 12th of November, Catherine made her state entry into London. The King, Queen and Prince Arthur watched the procession from the window of Master William Geoffrey in Cheapside. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth were noted to have worn crowns and velvet robes trimmed with ermine. 2 days later, Arthur and Catherine were wed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Life seemed to be good for King Henry VII. He had an heir and a spare. He had a loving wife. He was in negotiations with Scotland for sorting out the marriage for his eldest daughter Margaret. Arthur was married to a powerful Spanish infanta who would hopefully provide Henry with grandchildren and future heirs to continue the Tudor line. Oh, how things can change. 5 months later, on the 2nd of April 1502, King Henry VII was asleep at Richmond Palace. His friar woke him, saying, "Your dearest son hath departed to God." Henry, who I could imagine was feeling a multitude of emotions all at once, cried. Elizabeth comforted her husband, reminding him that he has 3 other children and God is still where he was, and we are both young enough. It was then her turn. She too broke down, and Henry comforted her. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, had died from the sweating sickness at his home in Ludlow Castle. He was 15. Catherine was now a widow, and no one really knew what to do with her. King Ferdinand wanted his daughter and her dowry to return to Spain, something that King Henry did not want. Ferdinand's threat was intended to scare Henry into agreeing a new marriage between Catherine and Henry, Duke of York, Arthur's younger brother. King Henry VII could see the advantages of this new union, but He had hopes that after 5 months of marriage, Catherine might be pregnant with Arthur's child. He asked her pretty bluntly if she was still a virgin, to which she said that she had only slept with Arthur for 6 nights and remained untouched. A marriage between the Duke of York and Catherine was desirable to both King Henry VII and the widowed Catherine. She was bored in mourning, and Henry could keep her dowry. This was because when a widow was mourning, they were not allowed to dance in public, they were not allowed to take part in court entertainment, and to Catherine, a second marriage was a way of escaping her mourning prison. Tragedy struck the Tudor family once again on the 11th of February 1503, as Queen Elizabeth of York dies in childbirth, trying to provide another male heir. Neither her or the baby girl, named Catherine, survived. News of the Queen's death was heavy and dolorous to the King, as ever was seen or heard of. The King departed to his chambers to pass his sorrows, and when he did re-emerge, the man that came out was altogether colder and more isolated, and one that began to treat his people with more harshness and severity than had been his custom. I think it's fair to say that the King never recovered from his wife's death. After Elizabeth's death, the question on everyone's lips was, who was the King going to remarry? It looked like at one point that King Henry was suggesting to marry the widowed Catherine to try and keep Catherine's dowry and the Spanish ties, but her parents were shocked and furious at the notion, so he quickly changed his mind and never did remarry. Instead, he proceeded with a treaty for his son, Henry, Duke of York, to marry Catherine 2 years later in 1505, when the Duke of York was 14. After Elizabeth's death, Henry VII became overly protective of Henry, Duke of York, and he was not allowed to leave his room except for exercise. The marriage treaty was signed on the 23rd of June 1503. 2 days later, the Duke of York and Catherine of Aragon were formally betrothed. The Tudor family was disrupted once again with Margaret Tudor, Henry's now eldest surviving child, leaving to go to Scotland. Margaret marries King James IV of Scotland at Holyrood Abbey on the 8th of August 1503, and later that year on Boxing Day, Henry and Catherine received their marriage dispensation from the Pope. On the 18th of February 1504, Henry, Duke of York, was formally created the Prince of Wales, but 8 months later, on the 26th of November 1504, Catherine of Aragon's mother, Queen Isabella of Castile, died. The news didn't reach England, though, till the December, and Catherine devalued overnight. You see, Isabella ruled Castile in her own right, and she did not put her husband as her heir. Instead, it went to her daughter Juana. Catherine was no longer the daughter of mighty Spain. She was now a daughter of the much smaller and less prestigious Aragon. Henry VII was now seriously considering the match for his son Henry, trying to get other alliances, and he stopped Catherine's allowances. The 28th of June 1505 was the 14th birthday of Henry, Prince of Wales, and he and Catherine were supposed to be wed soon. But King Henry VII, unbeknownst to Catherine, was trying to delay the wedding in hopes of a better match, but without losing her dowry. Catherine couldn't afford to pay her servants, and her gowns were getting shabby. Both Ferdinand and Henry refused to pay for her upkeep, as they saw it as the other's responsibility, although she was fed, so that's a plus point. King Henry VII was so desperate to get out of this wedding arrangement that the night before the Prince of Wales' birthday, he got his son in front of the Bishop of Winchester and made him revoke his betrothal to Catherine on the grounds that they were too young to have made an informed decision. This scandalous meeting was deliberately done in private, so Henry still had Catherine as an option, but if a better match presented itself, he could break the pre-contract without difficulty. It seems to me that somebody wants to have his cake and eat it. In the October, King Henry VII was in negotiations with Catherine's older sister, Juana, and her husband, Philip, in hopes of agreeing a marriage between the Prince of Wales and their 6-year-old daughter Eleanor, who was a much greater prize than Catherine. What you've got to remember is that Catherine was devalued overnight by the death of her mother. Catherine was now only the daughter of Aragon, not the mighty Spain. Eleanor was the daughter of the Queen Regnant of Castile, Juana, who was Catherine's older sister, and through her mother, she was also the heir to Aragon, while her father, Philip, was the heir to all of the Habsburg territories. Juana's husband, Philip, also had a vendetta against his father-in-law, so this marriage would have been a great way of sticking it to Ferdinand. In the January of 1506, Philip and Juana made a surprise visit to England as they got shipwrecked off the English coast. King Henry welcomed them to Windsor Castle, and the two men seized the opportunity to continue discussing marriage arrangements between their children. Catherine, who had been shunned by the English royal family and still being kept as a pauper for someone of her status, was allowed to wear her nice dresses. Historians aren't too sure if her dresses were new or whether they were fixed, but in my personal opinion, considering how stingy Henry was, and knowing that he used to make Elizabeth of York get her dresses fixed so he didn't have to buy new ones, I'm going to say he had her dresses fixed. Henry only allowed Catherine 30 minutes with her sister. This was to try and prevent her from complaining to Juana about how she'd been treated. Henry was all about keeping up appearances, and she had hoped that Juana may be able to help her situation and potentially talk to their father. Juana, however, was too depressed and wrapped up in her own problems that Catherine never attempted to ask, and the sisters no longer had much in common. Okay, so what about the marriage? Did Philip and Henry come to an agreement? Well, no, nothing got agreed, and that was the last we heard of it, so no. Philip and Juana left England in the April. In 1507, King Henry entered negotiations with Emperor Maximilian for a betrothal between his daughter, the Princess Mary, and Max's grandson, Charles of Castile, an alliance that would be highly advantageous for England and would also mean that Henry would no longer need Ferdinand or Catherine. In the autumn, Ferdinand had usurped his daughter Juana as the ruler of Castile, and Henry started to look upon Catherine in a more favourable light again. At the start of the year, Henry VII had hoped on marrying Juana himself, as Philip had died not long after returning from England the previous year. By marrying Juana, Henry would thereby rule Castile as well, as Juana's mental illness was starting to be evident. But to do so, he would need Ferdinand's permission. Don't forget, Juana and Catherine were sisters, and therefore they are both the daughter of Ferdinand. When Henry told Catherine of his plans to marry her sister, she supported the alliance between the two, as she thought that her own marriage to the Prince of Wales would get back on track. Catherine wrote to her father and did not expect him to want to keep Castile, but being the power-hungry monarch that he was, Ferdinand instructed Catherine to tell Henry that it was not yet known whether Queen Juana will be inclined to marry again, although it was certain that if she did become so inclined, it shall be no other person than the King of England. But by the September, Henry had lost interest in Juana, as it became evident that Ferdinand was playing mind games and Juana was not going to remarry. By September 1508, King Henry VII had stopped Catherine's allowance once again, after years of back and forth between him and Ferdinand of who owes who money. Ferdinand threatened war if Henry went through with the negotiations between the Prince of Wales and Eleanor of Austria. At this point in time, King Henry VII realised that his health was failing him, and come January of 1509, it was strongly suggested by the king that his son should marry Catherine, out of fear of not having a succession. On his deathbed, King Henry admitted to his son that he was not happy over his poor treatment of the Princess Catherine and told his son to do the honourable thing. Although he revoked his vows in 1505, only the two Henrys and the Bishop of Winchester knew. The rest of the world thought they were still betrothed. And with that, King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, died at Richmond Palace on the 21st of April, 1509. He was 52. He was ill for the last few years of his life, but there have been some discussion about whether he died from TB or an unknown illness. He was buried in the extravagant Lady Chapel he had built at Westminster Abbey, and was laid to rest next to his beloved wife Elizabeth of York. Upon his father's death, Henry, Prince of Wales, became King Henry VIII, arguably one of the most infamous kings in English history. And although he was hesitant to marry Catherine, as she was his brother's widow, Ferdinand encouraged the union with the promise of the rest of her dowry and reassured the young king that they have been given dispensation from the Pope. King Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon on the 11th of June, 1509, and they had a joint coronation on the 23rd of June, 1509 at Westminster Abbey. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the reign of King Henry VII, the founding Tudor monarch. If you did, please consider supporting me in the best way you can, whether it's through subscribing or listening to another. In the next one, we will be visiting the early life and reign of King Henry VIII.